All right, welcome back to part 2 of the final exam review. We left off with some questions from the Souls of Black Folk, which was the Du Bois chapter. The next chapter that I've got here is the Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so the first question you want to be concerned with: what was the relationship of Plessy versus Ferguson decision to the Brown versus Board of Education decision? So you'll have to know which came first, what that relationship was. Number 2, what was the positive aspect of separate educational facilities according to the Board of Education? Remember, it's the Board of Education versus Brown. What did the Board of Education argue was the positive aspect of separate educational facilities on African American children in American society? Number 3, what clause of the 14th Amendment was violated according to the defendant, Brown? And that was what was argued in the case, and eventually it was decided upon using this clause of the 14th Amendment. Number 4, what were the facts of the case? What was Brown's case? Number 5, what was the significance of the court's ruling? Okay, so what was the impact in the ruling then? Next chapter, Executive Order 9981. First question is, which president made this order? Okay, this is the desegregation of the military. Number 2, what was the main purpose of the executive order? Kind of the answer I just gave you. Number 3, what future president's decisions in regards to minority populations and governmental positions were likely influenced by this order? So a number of presidents since then have made executive orders in regards to women, gays, serving in services and so forth. So the question will ask you, give you a number of examples, and so you should be able to make the connections then to these future presidents' decisions. Number 4, how did the public and military respond to the order? What do we always say when there's some idea that makes everything equal and fair? All right? I've said this in class many times. Our default position is not usually charitable in kind. Number 5, in addition to ending discriminatory practices in the military, what other critical provisions were added that were necessary for the implementation of the order? So the orders are very short, a very brief document. So it's very simple just to look. And what else, what other provisions were added to it besides the statement ending discriminatory practices? All right, next chapter, opposition to internment. Number 1, what previous racist actions, and these were institutionalized in the form of government acts and so forth, particularly at the state levels, in the late 19th and early 20th century were representative of the attitudes of the supporters of internment of the Japanese. All right, number 2, what were the typical associations and institutions that were common among the opponents of the internment? Okay, and I mentioned these in class as well. Number 3, who were the Friends of Nisei? So this is a group, Friends of Nisei, so you need to be able to know who these folks were. And number 4, who were the Friends of Issei? Okay, and what were their positions in regards to the internment? So you want to be clear about that, because they were not the same. Number 5, what does the author of Opposition to Internment say generally about the role of World War II on racial attitudes? So what eventually comes into American society as a result of our experiences in World War II and as a result of some of these responses at the national and state levels? Next chapter, Ain't I a Woman? The Sojourner Truth chapter. Number 1, why did Sojourner Truth change her name? What was her name before? Number 2, what groups of people in society does Truth compare in their access to equality? So in her speech, she references a number of different groups. Who does she reference? Number 3, what does the phrase, women ought to be able to turn it, that is the world, right side up again, referred to in her speech. Okay, so this requires you to think a little bit about what is she getting at this point here. Number 4, what's the main reason for the repetitive use of "ain't I a woman"? And you might think about this in terms of other famous speeches that we've read in class, like "I Have a Dream" speech. It also uses repetitive phrases in it. What's the purpose of these kinds of repetitive phrases? This is sort of a rhetorical purpose. Number 5, what group is Truth mainly advocating for? So who's she really representing? And next chapter, in "I Have a Dream." Number 1, what dream does King have for his children? Number 2, where was the King's speech delivered? All right, what was the site of this speech? Number 3, what was the check analogy? The cashing the check analogy. So you want to be clear about that. What was the check that needed to be cashed, according to King, and that the protesters had gathered for? Number 4, what was King advocating for? What was the main thrust of his argument? Number 5, what means did King advocate using to achieve equality? All right, so you may contrast the answer to that to the next chapter, which is the ballot or the bullet, the Malcolm X speech. First question in this chapter. Number 1, why does Malcolm X maintain that he is not an American? Number 2, what is the legislation that's currently being filibustered in the Senate that Malcolm X is angry and frustrated by? Pretty self-evident. Number 3, what is Malcolm X's position regarding the possible use of violence in response to racism? Number 4, what is black nationalism? Number 5, what religious affiliation is associated with Malcolm X? All right, and so I'm going to leave that as part 2 of the final exam review, and I'll come back and finish up in part 3. Thanks.